Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average decklist as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from being a good start to a great one. This week, get out your bike because we're going cycling. Gavi Warden is a 5-mana Jeskai commander, a 2/5 human shaman that lets us pay 0 rather than paying the cycling cost of the first card we cycle each turn. Plus, whenever we draw our second card each turn, she'll create a 2/2 red and white dinosaur cat creature token. Gavi wound up as the third most popular commander from the Ikoria Precon cycle, and speaking of cycle, that's exactly what we've got going on here. She'd be quite the competitor in the Tour de France. Gavi has the potential to drift into the same type of territory as Angie Falconwrath, for example, the Rakdos Madness commander. Famously, Ms. Falconwrath does not care at all about the specific abilities of the Madness cards that are in her deck. She just cares whether the card has the Madness ability at all. The actual cards themselves are practically interchangeable. As sometimes happens with commanders that care this much about specific mechanics or keyword abilities, Gavi runs that same risk. She can just discard cards and draw cards with cycling so often that it almost doesn't even matter what it is that they do. But only almost. There's still a lot of cool, unique cycling stuff we can pull off here. Alright, let's take Gavi's average deck list and import it into the Archidect deck building website. Remember, the swaps we make to this list must either be cost neutral or help lower the price of the overall list. The original Precon deck for Gavi only contained like 30 cards with the cycling ability. To put it bluntly, that's excruciatingly low. In my experience with the original Precon, it ran out of steam so badly. The average list we're seeing here contains 42 cycling cards, which has me feeling a lot better. Roughly 10 of these cycling cards are land cards, so that means from the original Precon with about 60-ish non-land cards, only 1/3 of those were cycling cards that could fuel the commander's ability. Now, with the average list containing 42 cycling cards and 10 of those being lands, that means about half of our non-land cards are cyclers, which is a much better rate for us to keep our wheels spinning. This also means that there's a lot of pressure on the non-cycling cards in the deck, so we've got some analyzing to do. Let's tackle this list in the following 3 categories. First, we of course have to make sure that we warm up. Next, we'll celebrate the cycle of life. And finally, we'll cross the finish line. Let's start with section 1. The first and possibly most important thing that we have to do is take a very critical look at the non-cycling cards in this deck. If we run out of cards to cycle, our engine will sputter and completely stall out. So any cards that don't have cycling and therefore don't participate as much in that engine, they've really got to be worth their salt. Overall, our non-cyclers largely fall into 3 specific categories. The first and most obvious one is mana acceleration. We've got some rocks here that we can mix and match as we see fit. The second category is full of cards that help us continue the cycling engine. There's Valakut Awakening, for example, or Windfall, or even that Teferi Planeswalker, which all help us keep digging and drawing and give us a big boost. I'll also include the double draw effects in this category, which are huge for us because they amplify our engine super nicely, therefore allowing Gavi to make a token basically every turn. Finally, the third category is the win conditions. Gavi's 2/2 cat tokens aren't going to win the game on their own after all. We've got some help in this category, like the Locust God, but then also some pingers that help melt enemy life totals, such as Psychosis Crawler, or Niv Mizzet the Firemind, or Bralin the Skyshark Rider. Those all incrementally reduce enemy life totals as we're cycling on by, but some effects like Zenith Flare can help us bolt someone's face for 20 in the late game. So knowing those 3 categories, our mana acceleration, our engine boost, and our win conditions, that makes me turn my attention to the non-cycling cards that don't quite fit into one of those categories. If they don't help in one of those areas, they'd really have to knock it out of the park to be worth it. And unfortunately, some of these non-cyclers don't do quite enough to justify themselves here. First up, we have Surly Badgersaur. This card has potential, but it's unwieldy, and it doesn't really grease the wheels that need greasing. We're not too desperate for its treasure ability, and although we like the removal ability that it can provide, we will want that in a different, more reliable manner. I'm going to swap it for a simple Blasphemous Act. We don't have tons of removal in this deck, but the ones we do play need to have a bit more of a guarantee than the fighting ability of the Badgersaur. If we weren't on a budget, I would totally say Cyclonic Rift, which would make ton of sense here, but as it is right now, the Badger is going to turn blasphemous. Sun Titan is my next example. This thing can get back the cards from our grave that we've cycled away, which mostly consists of lands or mana rocks, and sorry, but that just doesn't seem great. That doesn't continue our engine, and this creature is certainly not going to close the game in combat anytime soon either. Now, importantly, Sun Titan can get back one of our most important enchantments, the Astral Blinking cards, but there are other cards that we could run in this slot instead that do that same type of thing, and they're not as much mana. There's utility for the Sun Titan here, but at 6 mana, it's kind of a speed bump. And the same actually goes for the Phoenix too. This can get back a very specific type of cycling card in instant or sorcery. I'm just not into it though, especially since its own personal get me back ability is kind of strange. However, while I don't dig the Titan or the Phoenix precisely, I do like what they represent. So I want to add Warden of the Eye to replace them, which I think I might need to explain a bit. Warden of the Eye can get back any non-creature, non-land card, which is better flexibility than the Phoenix, who is restricted only to cycling instants and sorceries. And it gets that card back to our hand, which is actually better than the Sun Titan, who puts things into play. Because then, if that card has cycling, we can discard and draw and continue our engine. Putting things back onto the battlefield can actually be a liability for us, because our deck just wants us to keep drawing and drawing and drawing. More importantly though, we've got non-cycling spells here that we're actually really keen to cast multiple times. Zenith Flare comes to mind, for example. That sounds like a great effect to cast twice. Or maybe Windfall again if we need to. Or we can get back that Fierce Guardianship that came in the original precon. Oh, and I won't make this an official inclusion, but Warden of the Eye is also a wizard, like Niv Mizzet or Riel, which means that if you like the wizard cycling ability from that Future Sight card Vidalcan Aethermage, it fits in quite handsomely there too. If you'll permit me to keep going though, it also has not escaped my notice that the decklist contains blink effects as a primary cycling payoff. Blinking is so good for us. We can protect our commander from removal by flickering it whenever it's targeted by some harmful spell, or we can even do that to enemy creatures that try to attack us. Or better yet, we can block with one of our creatures and then flicker our creature before damage is dealt to save it. Blinking plays a big role in our deck, and Warden of the Eye lines up with that perfectly. I really like the idea of cycling a spell, blinking our Warden of the Eye, and then getting that very same spell back to our hand. That's a very good engine. Blinking Warden of the Eye multiple times can help us basically cycle ad infinitum, or get back our most important spells multiple times and use them to cross the finish line. Alright, that was a good warm-up, but let's move now to section 2, the cyclers themselves. We have a weird relationship with the cycling cards that wind up in our hand. To be blunt, we just aren't very attached to them. They're a disposable tool. Their effects can be neat, but if we hold on to one of them for too long in hand or cast one of them, we have to recognize that not cycling that card is a very big opportunity cost. Cycling in this deck isn't just discarding a card and drawing a card. Rather, it's the beginning of a chain reaction. It's one of a multitude of drops that make up our ocean. With that said, we do still care about the abilities that our cycling cards have. Our opponents will expect us to cycle away most, if not all of them, and they won't always expect to be completely blown out by us actually casting one of those cards. But that's exactly what we can do. Most EDH decks don't like to use very hyper-specific cards that only help you respond to very, very niche situations. Rather, they prefer to use ubiquitous, universal, very flexible cards. You never know what you might encounter in a game of EDH, so having a good flexible utility spell can help you get out of a lot of different sticky situations. But cycling decks can make great use of hyper-specific spells. Most of the time we'll just be cycling the spell away anyway, even if it isn't useful in this particular gameplay scenario. But if a scenario does come up where that spell would be useful, well, it isn't just useful in that case, but it can actually really hardcore scupper our opponents by being a silver bullet to their strategy. Plain and simple, what I want to do here is improve the cycling cards we have. First, Yadaro. Sorry, Turtlebud, but this, quote, payoff isn't built for singleton formats. I'm actually going to chop Eternal Dragon too, which has the plain cycling ability instead of traditional cycling. This card's nice, but it's not what we really need. A lot of our payoffs, Commander included, care very much about the act of drawing cards, so it's good for us to sculpt our cycling cards around that. Besides, the consistency that the land searching ability would provide us here is actually also fulfilled by the quick rate at which we're able to filter through our deck anyhow. In fact, on that land cycling subject, I'm cutting Migratory Route for the exact same reasons as Eternal Dragon. Second verse, same as the first. So let's see what cycling cards we could add in here that might surprise our opponents. This isn't the most splendid removal spell in the universe, but Radiant's Judgment is a really nice option to have. It removes a creature that we care about, and like we saw with the Blasphemous Act earlier, this deck could stand to have a few more removal options, especially when they're tied this closely to the deck's primary theme. Unlike clunky creatures like the Eternal Dragon, we might actually run into situations where we need to cast a removal spell like this, and we'll be really happy to have that option when we do. Don't worry about our turtle friend or our dragon buddy. They weren't going to be all that instrumental in helping us win the game anyway. We're going to get to that in the next section. The next addition is Akroma's Blessing, a card I'm frankly astonished not to see in the original list to begin with. This card protects our creatures from removal, or helps our board of tokens fend off an attack, or it lets us just complicate battle for our enemies by making our creatures unblockable by a specific color. This thing's great. Speaking of combat, I really want us to play Angel Song. It's a fog for 2 mana, and that probably sounds kinda dull, right? But if we don't need it, we'll just toss it away and keep our engine chugging. And if we do need it, we'll really need it. Fogs are way stronger in EDH than other formats. How many times have we seen a Craterhoof or an Overwhelming Stampede clock the entire table out of nowhere? A cycling card that occasionally may help us escape from certain death is exactly the type of defensive utility we need to make sure we can survive long enough for our plans to fulminate. Oh, and before I take off from this section, let's actually up the cycling count by 1 more. Myriad Landscape is a smidge awkward in 3-color decks. And I know that this is colorless, but Blasted Landscape is a cycling land, so we should absolutely play it, at least until WotC finishes the cycling dual land cycle from Amonkhet. We tackled some non-cycling cards in the first section, but I'd like to return to that idea once more. Let's address the best of the best and find our deck's win conditions. So this is probably a good time to talk about Decree of Annihilation, huh? Decree of Annihilation destroys all lands when it's cycled, and Gavi can make that cycling cost completely free. So if we want to destroy all the lands, that's a thing that we can do. No one will have lands, we keep cycling and making cat tokens, and yeah, it's pretty hard for enemies to come back from that kind of thing. I totally respect your decision to go down that route if you wanna, but for our purposes here, I'm not gonna make it an official recommendation. It didn't show up in the average list, and beyond that, I personally feel that land destruction is a very specific type of tempo play that should be used to secure a subsequent victory almost immediately after it's cast. Gavi's win conditions are decidedly very gradual. You know, she's not spinning out some crazy combo or getting 86 Niv-Mizzet draw triggers in a single turn. Even if we destroyed all lands, she still takes some time to close the door. She's very methodical about the way that she earns victory, and that's what we should turn our attention to and try to hone. Here are some of our most classic methods of victory. Psychosis Crawler, Niv-Mizzet, and Dranth Stinger effects all help, quote, ping enemy life totals. Some creatures, like Riel, can also get pretty big, but the individual beat sticks are much more rare for us. Then there's also the token route. Gavi's tokens themselves are usually pretty defense-oriented throughout the majority of the game, and we'd really have to wait for a while for that army to build itself into a lethal board state. That's not to say it can't happen, just that it requires time and effort to do so. She's not the only token maker, though. Locust God, for example, can really help out there too, and Ominous Seas can build up quite a lot if we let it. I want to add to this because I think turning the corner and truly closing the door on the game is something that Gavi struggles to do quickly and efficiently. These are all good cards, but they require time to make lethal, and our opponents are loath to let us have that kind of time. First, I'll tackle the tokens part. If we weren't on a budget restriction, Divine Visitation would, of course, be fantastic. Angel tokens pack a lot more punch, and their evasion makes them sickening to build up. We're not breaking the bank here, though, so I'm going to suggest Mirror Entity. Unassuming, perhaps, but if we've got 4 cat tokens and our mana is all untapped because it doesn't cost us mana to use cycling abilities, well, this can be very deadly. Next, I want to tackle the pinging damage ability win con, and this requires me to make a cut to make room. I'm sorry to say it, but I'm cutting Lightning Rift, and I'm replacing it with the card Glinthorn Buccaneer. The rate of scale is just excellent for the Buccaneer since it hits every opponent, which I really enjoy, and it also isn't just restricted to cards we cycle. If we discard to hand size or to windfall effects, the Buccaneer still triggers too. And unlike the Lightning Rift, it doesn't cost extra mana to activate. My younger brother plays Gavi, and I've seen his frustration with the Lightning Rift card enough times to know that there are more consistent options out there that don't require an extra tax to help us get where we need to go. Speaking of which, I have to make another cut before my next edition, so I'm going to turn a critical eye upon Herald of the Forgotten. This card gets us back our permanents with cycling that wound up in our graveyard, provided that we've cast the Herald from our hand. So that's 8 mana to get back. Well, what can this get back? It's mostly a lot of lands, and then a couple of creatures, I guess, but that's hardly going to be a lethal board state, even if we do get back a bunch of cards like the Sphinx or the Nimble Obstructionist. The best cards to get back really are our enchantments, and even then, those aren't going to do a ton to affect the board state as soon as Herald brings them back. Sorry, Herald, you were even one of the EDH Retcast's preview cards, but I don't know if I can endorse you here. 8 mana is a lot, and the rate of return just isn't quite big enough compared to what our opponents are going to be up to at that type of mana cost. So what's my final recommendation? Well, some may not like it, but I've rarely seen a deck that can so nicely take advantage of the card Approach of the Second Sun. Gavi cycles and cycles and cycles and cycles and cycles so much that she'll get this thing back in really good time. And to be honest, the way the game changes after someone casts Approach of the Second Sun is really engaging. This card is a ticking time bomb, and that injects a lot of awesome tension into a game, in a way that Gavi herself is actually very prepared for. We've got our astral enchantments to defensively flicker attackers, and tokens to shield our life total as we must now stave off 3 players who seek to dismantle our archenemy style ticking clock. I know not all players like you win the game type of cards, especially if it feels like they just hand someone victory that is almost impossible to respond to. It can feel like, oh, well, now the game is over, I guess. Kind of feels like the stuff that happened before this point didn't even matter. However, in this deck, I view approach a lot like the card Felidar Sovereign in life gain decks. We actually have to prepare quite a bit for it. We have to wait for the right time to try and deploy it and stave off the aggression that it will draw, all of which we can do, but we have to do really wisely, and which also encourages the exact interactivity, combat, and kookiness between players that we love so much about the Commander format. A lot of Gavi's other win conditions can be kind of gruelingly slow, so this gives us another diverse win condition option that can really take enemies by surprise if we plan it well. Plus, at the end of the day, I'd rather Gavi win in an efficient manner such as this, rather than by taking forever to peck enemies to death after using a Decree of Annihilation. Alright, that should do it! Our average has been upped! You can find a link to the decklist in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've had a good time with the Gavinist card, Gavi Nest Warden, and if you got any other recommendations for your fellow cyclers, make sure you leave those in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.